Konnor Myrvik, Narrative Speech. Communication is and always will be a key aspect in life. People are always interacting with one another, whether it's verbally or non-verbally. We are social people and cannot help ourselves but to communicate with one another. Verbal communication involves such things as tone, clarity, word choice, rate of speech, and language, while nonverbal communication involves such things as hand gestures, facial expressions, and posture. With all this communication, there's bound to be some miscommunication and misperception. Miscommunication can often lead to laughter, confusion, frustration, and even anger. Unfortunately, I had a bad communication experience myself, and it happened when I went out to eat to a restaurant on a family vacation to Mexico. It was 2 years ago when my family and I went down to Puerto Vallarta. I expected it to be a change in culture, but not the culture shock I experienced. Since I thought it was a tourist attraction, I thought it would be very well Americanized. But it was a completely different world down there, and way out of my element. It was the first night out, and we went out to eat at a local restaurant outside of the resort. We had a difficult time understanding the waiter, because he had a heavy accent on the little English he knew. My high school Spanish seemed to be not enough to communicate with his full on. I felt foolish, asking to repeat many words. I asked him to explain the meal. Onions, yes or no, peppers and rice, all had to be yes or no's. Eventually, I just got a plain burrito because I couldn't understand and we couldn't communicate well enough. It was still delicious, but my bad communication was still not over. My family made the mistake by asking for directions to the nearest market. We tried to enunciate the words so he could better understand, but it was still difficult. Eventually, we pulled out a map and he directed us. We eventually thanked him and went on our way. I never thought how complicated communication with somebody could be. This incident obviously happened because the man and I were completely from different cultures. It was hard to speak with one another because he had the heavy accent on his English words and I barely knew any Spanish. I could only understand a couple of words out of every sentence he was saying. This scenario happened because I traveled to a new country for the first time without a clue of what to expect. Now that I look back on it though, I do feel as if I could have changed some things to make the confliction not as much. I do know that the situation is not completely avoidable because it was a new experience, a new culture, and it causes confusion, but there was one way to avoid it by maybe learning some better Spanish before so I could know their native language and easier communicate with them. Knowing the basics did help me, but being fluent in the language would have helped me a lot more. Another thing was staying at the resort and eating there instead of going out into the town and adventuring. They know the tourists at the resort and they know the language, rather than the local businesses. The con of that is that you wouldn't get to experience the adventure and what the town is really about. I do not regret traveling outside of my comfort zone, and I do believe that I have learned many things from my experiences, good and bad, down in Mexico. After being down in Mexico for about a week, I became more accustomed to the culture that I was immersed in. I not only began to understand their English better, but also some of the Spanish they were saying. I feel that if I stayed in Mexico longer, the more I would understand it. I learned from my experience that even if we have miscommunication at first, if you try and work through it, you will eventually get what you're trying to say. If you are having a hard time communicating with someone, it helps to slow down your speech, repeat words, and use visual tools. My experience down in Mexico seemed to be negative and scary, but now that I look back on it, I learned a lot about how I can better communicate with people I don't fully understand.